My parents want me to move out while still paying rent so my golden brother can live with them, but I'm doing something better, staying with the house. My mother is what many would call a son-obsessed mother. The worst day of her life was when my brother left for college, tied with the day he announced he was getting married. She had a grand time making the attention revolve around her at his wedding. I mean, she wore a wedding dress disguised as a mother of the groom gown. But when he didn't move back home with his wife to fulfill her dream of a multi-generational household, she was back to being in a bad mood. Now, I'm not saying she's done anything to make him lose his job, but she's definitely been wishing for a reunion with her dear baby boy for years. The fact that he's completely broke and has nowhere to go is just semantics, really. That brings us to why I'm making this post. I'll use fake names. And this is a temporary account, simply because I don't want to risk someone finding this and connecting it to me. While he hasn't come home yet, my brother Greg lost his job. He lives in Arizona, which is a full day's drive without stopping or sleeping for 24 hours straight. So we haven't seen him in ages. Naturally, our mom seized the opportunity to convince him to move back in with her and have him under the same roof for the first time in over a decade. I can't even imagine he actually wants that, but I don't think he has many options. His wife, Skylar, doesn't work, and I suspect it's because my brother is one of those guys who believes the man provides and the woman stays home. And my parents can't really fund their life in another state, especially since neither of them works either. You see, right after Greg got married and decided to stay in Arizona, my dad decided it was time to retire, since my brother and I were already adults. And I, refusing to marry, was supposed to step up, as a daughter should, and care for my parents. I was about 22, fresh out of college, but I had a good job, and my childhood home is a 10-minute commute, so I thought, why not? My brother wasn't around to have to deal with it anyway. Plus, they heavily hinted they'd give me the house in a few years, since my mom wanted me to move to Arizona to be closer to Greg once he had kids. Clearly, that didn't pan out, as in the past 5 years, not only has Greg not had any kids with Skylar, but he only calls maybe once a month. Tops. The last time I saw him was 2 Thanksgivings ago, when he finally flew back instead of mom and dad visiting him. He spent the whole weekend complaining about his job, his house, how much he hated working, and nearly everything he could think to gripe about. Safe to say Greg and I don't get along. He's 4 years older than me, so I only had to endure him for 14 years before he left for college. But pretty much every one of those days was awful. Everything Greg said was important. He didn't share any of his toys, I didn't get to pick what movie we watched, and I didn't decide what we had for dinner either. He got presents on every one of my birthdays so he wouldn't, quote, feel left out. I mean, I was absolutely an accident baby, and it was made very clear I'd never ever measure up to Greg. Yes, things got better after he left. I think mom was so bored without him around that she started giving me all her attention when she wasn't trying to drown him in phone calls and emails. It was a bit smothering, and the comparisons didn't fully fade, but I was the center of attention for the first time in my life, so call me selfish for milking it. I stayed close to home for college and landed a good job in the city right after graduating. Mom threw me a graduation party, which was quickly overshadowed by Greg's engagement announcement. But whatever. The next year he got married, and Dad retired. It's been 5 years since then, and Greg is too busy with his life in Arizona to bother me much with his opinions on women working outside the home, or how I should be more feminine and get married already. I don't know if he realizes that the fact I haven't is the only reason he doesn't have to worry about mom and dad, since I can care for them as a direct result of my unfeminine choices. The only thing I've really had to deal with is mom's frequent meltdowns over her son living so far away, the fact he hasn't given her grandkids, or that Skylar must be convincing him to stay away. Which she isn't. In fact, I think she's a decent person and seems to genuinely like my family for some reason. Now, with Greg recently unemployed and Skylar being a homemaker with no work experience, they have no money. Even though Phoenix is cheaper than Seattle, they really won't be able to afford staying there much longer without income. Since Greg has struggled to find a job, my mom very emphatically suggested they move back home. I think Skylar is the one who talked him into agreeing. Honestly, Greg might be a self-centered guy who thinks the world owes him everything, but not even he can handle mom's smothering for long without feeling suffocated. Still, he had no better options. Though considering how much he hated his job, I don't think he's really tried hard to look for other offers, if I'm honest. Important note. About 4 years ago, after a full year of leaving Greg's room untouched, like a shrine to her golden son after he married and didn't return, nearly 9 years total, my dad converted the room into a private yoga studio for my mom, who religiously does yoga. Of course, he didn't anticipate her meltdown over dismantling Greg's precious shrine, but she eventually got over it and started using the space. It's actually one of the things we bonded over after Greg left. I was a cheerleader, and yoga kept me flexible through high school, so I was happy to pick it back up with her at home. Here's the thing. The yoga studio means one fewer bedroom. While that's fine when it's just my parents and me, Greg and Skylar moving in complicates things. I mean, when they came for Thanksgiving that time, I was relegated to the couch their entire stay. A weekend on the couch is manageable, but their long-term move would require a more permanent solution. When my parents asked to talk about Greg moving, I honestly expected them to ask me to pay to convert the yoga studio back into a bedroom. Maybe even fix up the basement as a suite so Greg and Skylar could have their own space. The truth is, I've been paying rent since taking on the role of breadwinner and employed family member, covering all bills and giving my parents some spending money. But renovating the basement would definitely cost more than they could cover with that. But that's not what they asked. My mom made it very clear quickly that since we don't have enough space, they thought it best for me to move out. After all, it was time for me to leave the nest and meet a nice man. With Greg and Skylar home, it'd get too crowded, especially if they started having kids, which my mom really hopes they will, and seems to want them to do under her roof. Here's the kicker. Not only did they want me to move out, they wanted me to keep paying rent, to cover all the expenses. They want me to vacate the house so Greg can move in, but still pay for everything while he lives rent-free off my money. And I'd have to find a new place to live. I won't dive into everything I'm feeling now, but I'll say I'm beyond hurt, and yes, furious. I think my dad noticed I was about to blow up because he told me to take time to think it over and quickly whisked Mom away. I've taken a day so far and done nothing but dwell on the fact that my parents, after all, this time, are still willing to put my brother first. I've spent years supporting them while he's been off living his life across the country, not even bothering to return their calls. How should I react to this? Update. 1, I didn't expect my post to get so much attention, but apparently there are more people with dysfunctional families than I thought. Many of you left comments and DMs, so before I get into my update, which in my opinion is pretty major, I'll respond to some of those. This might sound a bit cheesy, but thank you for taking the time to comment. Apart from the people who told me women shouldn't be in the workforce and every creep in the Pacific Northwest who flooded my DMs like a swarm of vultures, I truly appreciate those of you who gave me real, reasonable advice. I decided to listen. I always knew my mom preferred Greg. I always knew he was her perfect golden son while I was just there. But things had been fine since he left. I was 14 when he left, and it's been 13 years since then. I've now lived almost as long without him as with him, but even 3 states away, I still lived under his shadow. Part of me always knew it. I mean, I've had my share of friends and boyfriends telling me so, but I wanted so badly to believe my parents, especially my mom, could see me as good enough that I kept ignoring it. I couldn't keep doing that. Not after such blatant favoritism was thrown in my face after 5 years of supporting them alone. They wanted me gone, so I left. I found an apartment within walking distance of my job, which has been amazing for my fresh air and vitamin D intake. Plus, I've started dating a guy, and honestly, having privacy is priceless. It was fully furnished, and I moved in immediately. I thought I'd have to work hard to keep my parents from finding my new address, but they didn't even bother to ask for it. That stung, but it gave me the final push to follow through with my plan. The night I moved the last of my things out of the house, along with my important documents, including my birth certificate and social security card, thank you comment section, for reminding me to grab them at midnight because I'm a drama queen at heart. I blocked my parents and brother on every platform I could think of. Yes, even LinkedIn, something I didn't even know was possible until then. Greg isn't even in Washington yet, so maybe it was premature. But I felt that if I delayed even a little, I'd settle back into living under his shadow. I needed to leave while I could, while the sting of my parents' favoritism was still fresh and raw. Does it hurt? Yes. And some days it still hurts a lot. But it's getting better. Tomorrow marks 1 week, and it's honestly been good for me. Beyond the morning walks to work, I've felt a peace I never knew I was missing. I can actually relax without fearing my mom's insults about my posture or her snapping at me for leaving a cup on the table. Maybe it hasn't been long enough to say for sure, but I think things are going well. Update 2. I spoke too soon. Maybe I jinxed it, as way too many of you said I would. Seriously, this place is absurdly superstitious. Want to know something I just found out through a 2-hour phone call that nearly blew out my right eardrum? Turns out Greg lost his job months ago, not weeks ago like I'd been told. No, he lost his job around the start of the year. Now, Arizona might not be the most expensive place in the country, but it's not the cheapest either. So you're probably wondering how the hell Greg and Skylar have been living there for months with no income. Here's the kicker. My parents took out a second mortgage on the house to give Greg money. I'd been paying their mortgage this whole time and thought I was being an amazing daughter by giving them extra money each month after my promotion. They went and remortgaged the house they claimed they'd leave to me and gave all the money to the guy who can't even bother to call them. You know what happens when you don't pay the mortgage? The bank takes your house. Foreclosure, that's a real thing, something my parents didn't consider until they started burning through their savings, the little they hadn't already spent or sent to dear Greg. They quickly realized they couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. Greg and Skylar have already moved in, but they definitely can't help financially. So now there are 4 people living in that house, all unemployed, with only a month's worth of mortgage money left. True to form, my mom called my Aunt Yasmin to complain. She's technically my great aunt, but she's 63, barely older than my mom and the only family we have here in Washington. However, my mom low-key hates her. Aunt Yasmin is a bit of a hoarder and nosy about everyone's lives, while my mom is a clean freak who also loves meddling in people's lives, so it's a match made in both heaven and hell. Still, they talk all the time because Aunt Yasmin firmly believes family sticks together. And after hearing I'd abandoned my family, she decided to call and tear into me. According to her, I'd left my parents on the brink of destitution with not a penny to their names. That's how I found out about the whole second mortgage situation and how they can't keep up without me. As far as Aunt Yasmin's concerned, the only thing I can do is hand over all the money they need and hope they find it in their hearts to forgive me. The way I see it, they can kiss my ass. Update 3. You'll either upvote me to oblivion or rip me apart in the comments. But read the whole thing before you say anything, okay? Let me give some context for those already typing. So, I visited my parents. I might not have appreciated Aunt Yasmin's yelling, but part of me wanted to confront them. I decided to do something about it. However, you'll be glad to know, I've gained some self-respect since I last saw my parents. Maybe it was the distance. Maybe it was the fact they didn't bother to reach out until they realized they were running out of money and only noticed I'd blocked them when they needed me. Either way, I wasn't going to let them walk all over me just because Greg was back, especially if I was going to bail them out and keep them off the streets. Doing this meant facing my brother in person for the first time in 2 years, and this time he wasn't drunk on Thanksgiving-themed cocktails. Sober Greg is about as fun as you'd imagine. Skylar was fine, as always. Still don't know why she married him, but that's irrelevant. I wasn't there to analyze their marriage. I was there to talk about buying a house. I think I mentioned in my original post, though I don't feel like scrolling back to check, that my parents had heavily hinted I'd get the house once Greg had kids, since our mom wanted to be close to her grandkids. Some of you will probably call me an idiot for not getting it in writing, but at the time, it felt like enough. Not anymore. This time, I went to my parents' house not intending to just pay their mortgage and let them play house with their golden son. They could keep doing that for all I cared, but I wanted the house's title in exchange. I'd already been paying the mortgage anyway and would keep doing so, but not for nothing. I could afford it, and they definitely couldn't. I added a condition. Greg would have to pay his and Skylar's bills once he got a job. I'd still cover all our parents' expenses. Honestly, I think my parents seemed open to the idea. Until Greg started screaming that I was trying to steal his inheritance and called me a scheming bitch, among other creative insults that might have been funny in another context. He yelled loud enough that Skylar nearly cried and left the room, then turned to our parents and outright said he wouldn't accept my offer. If you think my parents stood up to him even for a second, then I haven't done a good job explaining how completely he has them wrapped around his finger. So, yeah, I won't get the house. It's a shame, sure, but I also don't think they'll keep the house much longer. I'm pretty sure the non-payment period is about 4 months before the bank starts foreclosure. They'll either call me then or lose the house entirely. For my mental health's sake, I honestly don't care either way. Update 4. It's been 4 months since my last update, so you might want to refresh your memory. Here's a quick recap. After my brother Greg convinced our parents not to accept my very generous offer to buy the house and let them live in it while he and Skylar covered their own bills, I decided to let them figure things out on their own for a while. I meant it when I said I wouldn't let them walk all over me anymore. Plus, I figured my parents didn't have many other options. Aunt Yasmin might talk big about family sticking together, but she can't afford their mortgage on top of her own financial mess, and I'm sure my mom wouldn't agree to move in with her anyway. Sooner than I expected, I got a call. Not from my mom, but from Skylar. She could barely speak, clearly in the midst of a panic attack. After calming her down enough to understand her words, I learned she'd had a huge fight with Greg, who still refused to accept help even after receiving a letter from the bank. She knew my offer was their best shot at avoiding homelessness, but she had no job. She'd never worked a single day because Greg wouldn't allow it, and her own parents had cut ties with her. She'd been job hunting since Greg lost his job, but when he found out, he lashed out, leaving her stranded in the house with no options. She begged me to go through with my offer to buy the house and let them handle their own bills, even if Greg refused. At best, I'd get the house. At worst, I could walk away. It might sting, but I'd get over it. So I went back home and offered to buy the house again, but with revised terms. I still wanted the title in my name in exchange for covering the mortgage and letting my parents live there. However, Greg would have to do more than cover a few hundred in bills. I wanted him to match the amount I'd been paying in rent since I was 22. Would that cover the full mortgage? Sure, but I'd still handle the additional bills and all our parents' extra expenses. I didn't think it was unfair at all. Greg, of course, disagreed, but the bank's warning about overdue payments must have made my parents desperate enough to agree. So, long story short, I'm now the proud owner of a beautiful house in Seattle. I guess that makes me a landlord. Now, since I'm expecting rent payments from Greg, I told him he has 1 month to come up with the money or pack his bags and leave. Skylar, on the other hand, is welcome to stay if she wants. She might have married him, but I won't make her homeless just to prove a point. Greg, though, can fend for himself if that's his choice. Place your bets on whether he'll actually pay. I might update once I find out, but I don't plan to post again. Update 5. Yeah, I know it's been about 3 months, but I've been busy. And as many of you predicted, Greg didn't pay rent. I think he probably expected me to stay quiet and obedient like the good little sister and say nothing about it, but that's not me anymore. I'm done playing second fiddle to whatever he wants. So I kept my promise and started the eviction process. My parents immediately tried to push back. Clearly, they'd also hoped I'd let Greg slide now that I owned the house. But they were wrong. I meant it when I said I was done. If they wanted to protect him, they could leave with him, but not in my house. I began evicting them too. Before the eviction finalized, they realized I was serious. They packed up and moved in with Aunt Yasmin. She might be a hoarder, but she's a traditionalist who believes family comes first, so even though she and my mom can't share a room for more than an hour without wanting to rip each other's heads off, she took them in. My mom's a clean freak, so I'm sure she's thriving in that house where Aunt Yasmin hasn't thrown anything away in 60 years. My dad managed to land a job at a nearby mechanic shop to help support them, but it pays nowhere near what he made as a mechanic before. It's barely enough to keep the lights on with 3 extra mouths to feed for Aunt Yasmin. Greg, of course, went with them, but Skylar didn't. She'd been nagging him nonstop to actually pay rent here, and he refused. They had so many screaming matches that the neighbors called me to ask if everything was okay. Finally, she left. The day I served him the eviction notice. Her parents hated Greg and weren't thrilled with her decision to marry him, so I'm sure they were more than happy to take her back. Plus, she's even younger than me with her whole life ahead. With her degree and finally free of Greg, I'm sure she'll be just fine. The same can't be said for Greg. Maybe he'll find a job eventually, though it'll be way harder in the middle of nowhere where Aunt Yasmin lives than here in the city. Anyway, that's all. See you around. Update 6, it's been 3 years since I last posted here, and wow, have things changed. In these past months, I've gone from being just a wife to also becoming a mother, and while it feels like a lifetime since my last update, checking my old post shows it's only been 3 years. Yes, my first child was born a couple of months ago, and being a mom has been the most intense, rewarding experience I've had so far. If you're wondering who the father is, it's the same guy I was dating when I moved out. Back then, our relationship wasn't exactly serious, but as I rebuilt my life and focused on what I truly wanted, our bond grew. We got married last year in an intimate ceremony with our closest friends. Nothing fancy, but it was perfect. And then came our son, who's the light of our lives. As for my parents, there's not much to say because, honestly, our relationship is practically non-existent. I haven't heard from them in a long time, and I'm fine with that. The little I've learned about them comes from acquaintances or family gossip. Apparently, Greg finally got a job after years of unemployment. I don't know how stable it is or what he earns, but at least he's trying to take responsibility. Both he and my parents lived with Aunt Yasmin for a while until, predictably, cohabitation became unbearable. My mom and Aunt Yasmin have always had a tense relationship, and it was only a matter of time before their clashing personalities and my aunt's hoarding chaos shattered the truce. So, when things got too toxic, my parents and Greg finally moved out. As far as I know, they're now renting a place far from Seattle, since the rent prices here are impossible for them without the income I used to provide. I feel a mix of relief and satisfaction at owning my home and not relying on rent, because Seattle's still expensive, and being here without that worry is a privilege I deeply cherish after all I've been through. As for Skylar, she's carved her own path too. After staying at my place for a bit post-split from Greg, she finally landed a job and started building an independent life. In fact, it only took a few months before she moved out and filed for divorce. I'm proud of her. Deep down, she always wanted to work and have a more active life, even though Greg kept her trapped in his provider-husband vision where she wasn't allowed to work. It was brave of her to break free and take charge of her future, and I'm glad she did. When Skylar moved out of my house, I moved back in. First alone, then my boyfriend joined me, and now, after all this time, we live here together with our son. Building a family and a home of our own has been incredible. I haven't told my mom about the baby, nor did I invite my parents to the wedding or add them to this chapter of my life. I didn't want them involved. My mom eventually heard about the pregnancy and, from what I gather, tried to reconnect. I guess her desire to be a grandma temporarily outweighed her resentment, but I wasn't interested in letting her that close, not after everything. I also have no interest in Greg being part of our lives, though as far as I know, he got a job, out of state and moved. No further details, and honestly, I prefer he stays far away. I think that's all there is to share. Maybe I'll return in 3 or 5 years with something new, but as far as my family saga goes, that's it.